So as I said, welcome everyone to this webinar on mastering SEO A/B testing. I'm going to be running through hopefully everything from sort of start to finish that you need to know about what is SEO testing, how to set up experiments, some common questions like how is SEO testing different to user testing, a deep dive on some of the maths as well so that you can understand how we do the measurement part. And then, as I said, hopefully finishing off with some time for questions. So let's get started. Now, we're going to start in a slightly unusual place, which is to talk about basketball. So what you're looking at right now is a heat map of where most shots are taken in a basketball game. And so there's probably no surprises here. There's a lot of shots taken from the hoop area. So these are dunks and layups. There's also a lot of shots taken from outside the perimeter. So these are 3-pointers. And then there's a sort of mid-range shots that are taken as well. But crucially, this is how the game looked in 2001. It's not how it looks now. Today, it looks more like this. So you'll notice that there's basically no shots in the mid-range. Everything is either a shot at the hoop, so your dunks and layups, and then the outside perimeter, the 3-pointers. And so the question is, why is this? What happened? And the answer is player tracking cameras. So in most stadiums now, in every single stadium in the NBA, there are these cameras that can track what every single player is doing on the court. So they can see what position they're in, how many shots they take, and the accuracy of those shots. And this led to obviously tons and tons of data collection and some pretty interesting insights, particularly around the efficiency of those mid-range shots. And what they found was that those shots are almost as hard as 3-pointers, but they're worth less. And so that insight essentially led to eradicating a lot of those shots from the game. And that's why we ended up with this completely different heat map now, where basically people just take 3-pointers and dunks and layups. So they've got these ones which are easy enough to be worth it. And then, as I said, the outside 3-pointers, which although they're harder, they are at least being rewarded for it by the extra points. Excuse me. And so, yeah, the insight here is that, as I said, these are often the wrong shots to be taken. So why am I telling you this? Why am I talking about basketball and not SEO testing? Well, the reason is that at Search Pilot, we believe that SEO split testing is to SEO what player tracking was to basketball, in that we can hopefully take more of these easy shots, the dunks and layups, by running experiments and getting winning tests. We can create new pages and new content, which is harder to do and more expensive, but is worth investment because it's generating new content and more organic traffic. And we can stop taking these difficult and attractive, but surprisingly low percentage shots, which in this case is untested on-site changes. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but what we find is that a lot of the changes that you would see on a typical SEO audit are actually inconclusive or negative. And so a lot of the stuff that you will be spending time and money on are not worth it. And so we'll be digging into that in a little bit. And so that is what Search Pilot tries to do. We are an A/B testing platform that allows you to run tests from an SEO perspective and hopefully prevent rolling out changes which are accidentally negative and give you more dunks and layups so that you can get that incremental approach. Now, if you do any research into A/B testing, you will find things like this. This is a report on Harvard Business Review that showed that Booking.com run over 25,000 A/B tests a year. In another report, there was this example of a test that Bing ran where they compared, or they did a test where they changed the darkness of the color on the search results. And so slightly darker blues and greens in titles and lighter black in captions improved the user experience. And when they rolled that out across all users, they found that it boosted their it boosted their revenue by $10 million annually, which, although that sounds like a big number for a company the size of Bing, I guess it's probably a rounding error, but it just shows you that really small changes can result in big impacts. Now, it's not all upside. Those are positive examples that I've spoken about, but then there's also ones like this, where again, this is Bing tried to integrate social media into the search results. So this is when they tried to add Facebook and Twitter in sort of a third pane of search results. And what they found was that it had basically no impact on engagement or revenue, but it cost them about $25 million to build that experiment. And the reason I find this particularly interesting is it's quite timely at the moment with all the ChatGPT stuff happening. Both Google and Bing are trying to integrate that type of experience to the search results. And I just wonder, how much testing have they done on that, as opposed to rushing to do it because it's all the rage and that's what everyone's talking about at the moment. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that evolves and how much testing they'll end up doing on the user experience side of things. Now, all of that I've just spoken about is user testing. And so despite the maturity of user testing, SEO testing is actually still in its infancy. This is just a handful of companies that we know to be doing SEO testing. Some of them are SearchPilot customers, but across the board, a lot of companies aren't doing any SEO testing, which is a shame. Now, I want to talk about the value of SEO as a channel, because by framing it in that way, hopefully it will show just how big of an opportunity it is for companies to be doing this type of testing. Now, I'm going to use an example that I used in one of my previous webinars, which is looking at Nordstrom as an example. So Nordstrom, if you don't know, are a big retail company in the United States. And the question I set out to answer was, how much would it cost Nordstrom if they had a 1% drop in their organic traffic? And so fortunately, because they're a public company, their figures are readily available. You can go and look this up on your own. And what I found was the digital sales were almost $6 billion in the last 12 months. Now, of that, organic search, we estimate to make up about 2.6 billion, because it's about 44% of the traffic. And then if you divide that again to just look at the non-branded organic traffic, that means that it generates about $2 billion in revenue. So the SEO team at Nordstrom are essentially responsible, or they own, about $2 billion in organic revenue. So quite a big chunk of revenue. And so what that means is that a 1% drop in organic traffic is worth $20 million in lost sales per year, which absolutely blows my mind, because I don't know whether Nordstrom are doing testing or not. They're not a customer, by the way. I've picked them deliberately because they're not a customer. But many companies of their size are running SEO programs without any testing, or relying on suboptimal forms of testing, which we're going to talk about in a second. So that is where SearchPilot comes in. Our whole mission is to try and prove the value of SEO for the biggest websites in the world. And we do that by allowing our customers to make changes and test impact before they ever roll them out to the rest of the site. So I love this quote from our CEO, which sort of explains what I mean on the negative side of things. So he said, sometimes our customers' biggest wins come from never deploying losers rather than only deploying winners. And I think I can't stress that enough, because for a lot of the customers that we work with, they're already the market leader or the incumbent in a market. And so for them, it's not about getting 25% more organic traffic for a certain department. A lot of case, it's about a defensive play. They just need to make sure that they never accidentally roll out a change, which negatively impacts their organic traffic, because as you can see, it makes a big dent in the revenue. And so sometimes avoiding the losers is just as important as getting those winners. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what I actually mean by SEO testing, because a lot of the times when I do demos with new customers or prospective customers, they say, oh, I didn't realize that you could do more than titles and meta descriptions. And so I want to talk through some of the scenarios that you can actually test. So of course you can run things like title tag tests, like this one on the left, where they're changing the word price with cost. You can do meta description tests. This one, they're adding third-party ratings to meta descriptions. But you can also do things like adding content to the page. So you might decide to add more content, or reduce the content, or test adding ChatGPT content if that's what you want to do. And so you can definitely run those types of client-facing tests. And then on the more technical end, you also have things like structured data test. So you can add FAQ markup, schema markup, any sort of behind-the-scenes markup that you like. And on the super technical end, you have things like server-side content versus client-side content. So sometimes, particularly in the modern web, there's a lot of sites that rely heavily on JavaScript. So sometimes part of the web page is actually being served using JavaScript as opposed to server-side content. And so we've run tests where we make that server-side rather than relying on client-side. And then lastly is internal linking tests. So by far, I would say internal linking are some of the most successful and powerful tests that we do, because you're impacting so many tests on your site, and they tend to have a big impact when we get winning experiments. Now, there's lots more things you can do. I've just covered a handful of them. If you want to see more case studies, more examples of testing, you can go to the SearchPilot website. You can scan this QR code, or you can go to our site and look at the case study section. And you can actually sign up for our email list, and we'll send you a new case study every 2 weeks. So we've had a lot of good feedback on this. People seem to like it. And yeah, it's there if you want to sign up. Okay, so at this point, you might be thinking, depending on your background, well, how hard can it be? You know, can we not just look at our analytics data, that kind of thing? Well, from our research, we found that only about 10 to 20% of the tests that people run are positive. The rest are inconclusive or even negative in some cases. And so in essence, what that means is up to about 80% of your SEO tickets are probably useless. They're either not adding any value, or in some cases even hurting your traffic, but you've got no way of measuring that. And so this is surprising. It might be surprising to you. It might not be surprising if you have any background in user testing, because you'll see similar levels to this in user testing if you run those types of experiments as well. So one of the most common questions we get is, well, can you not just use your analytics? Can we not make a change and then go look at our traffic? And if it goes up, it's good. If it goes down, it's bad. That is called before and after testing. And the reason it doesn't work is, imagine the scenario where you want to make a change to your site. You go into your analytics and it's on this day. And then you roll it out and your traffic does this. Now, at this point, your traffic, it looks like it's decreased, but it's really hard to know whether that decrease is because of the change that you made or something else. So what if I told you that there was a Google update just after you launched the test? Would that influence whether you think this drop is because of the change that you made, or is it because of the Google update? And then when you add on top of that I might tell you that this was Thanksgiving. You've got seasonal impacts as well to take into consideration. And so while you can try and look at trends, and even you can do things like year-over-year comparisons, it's really, really difficult to draw any causal relationship between the change that you make and the resultant traffic without running a controlled experiment. And so I'm not saying you shouldn't look at before and after testing, just that is not what I'm talking about when I say doing SEO testing. The next question I get a lot is, well, what about rank tracking data or Search Console data? Can you not just use that? And again, the answer is no. Just looking at the rank tracking, first of all, if we look at Nordstrom as an example, and we look at the number of keywords that they rank for, according to Ahrefs, it says they rank for over 3 million keywords. Now, this will not be all of the keywords that Nordstrom ranks for. I'll guarantee there will be just as many keywords that they are not tracking, or the Ahrefs doesn't have data for. And so even if you see a bunch of keywords increase in ranking or decrease in ranking, there's likely a long tail of keywords that you're not able to measure that could be doing exactly the same thing. And so keywords are good for additional data, but they're not good enough or sensitive enough to be able to run accurate experiments from an SEO perspective. On the other side, we have Search Console data. And again, although Search Console is much better in recent years than it's been for a long time, this report by Ahrefs shows that almost half of the clicks that you get go to hidden terms. And so again, there's just no way that you can run successful experiments or a successful experimentation program with relying on data like this, because it's just not sensitive enough. And so again, I'm not saying to not look at that data, but you can't use it to draw causal conclusions about the test that you run. Okay, so you might be thinking at this point, all right, Craig, you've said why it's hard, you've said all the ways we can't do it. How do you do it? So let's get into that. The first thing to mention is that not all websites are suitable for SEO testing. The first thing you need is a website that has a lot of pages on the same template. So for instance, you ideally want a website that is structured like categories, subcategories, product pages. Now, it doesn't have to be, that sounds like e-commerce. It doesn't have to be e-commerce. I just mean in terms of the site structure, you need a lot of pages at one level that are all on the same template, another set of pages that are on the same template, and so on. That is the ideal. And what that means is, if we take this travel website as an example, if we look at all of the flights pages, they all look the same. They're on the same template. And although one page is about New York, one is about LA, one is about Seattle, the structure of that page is the same no matter what flight page you're on. They all have a heading, they have a search bar, they have an image, and then they have some text. And so when you find a group of pages like that, ideally hundreds, even better if it's thousands and tens of thousands, you can use that as a group of pages and then run experiments on only half of them, and then you have the other half to act as a control group. So the first thing you do is come up with a test idea. You might, for instance, make a change where you're moving content from the bottom of the page to the top of the page. We then have to decide what pages would be in the control and which ones will be the variant pages. Now, a couple of things to mention here. I am obviously using a very simple example here. I've only got 3 control pages and 3 variant pages. In reality, that wouldn't be suitable to run an SEO test. You would need hundreds of pages, ideally thousands, as I mentioned, but obviously so that it fits on the diagram and it's nice and easy to follow. I've only used 3 here. So multiply it by 10 or 100 to get an idea of the scale that we're talking about here. So imagine we've maybe got, as I said, 300 control pages, 300 variant pages, that kind of thing. So what we're trying to do is create 2 buckets of pages that have a similar level of traffic and are statistically similar to each other. So what I mean by that is, we don't want the control pages to have 1 million sessions a month and the variant pages to have 10,000 sessions a month, because that's completely, it's an unfair distribution of traffic. The second thing is, we want them to be statistically similar. And what I mean by that is, we don't want there to be a bias in the bucket before the test even begins. So for instance, imagine you are, let me think, imagine, let's just use travel. Imagine you're a travel website with flights, and you think of something like your all these destinations are going to have different seasons depending on the weather, how hot they are, how cold they are, whether it's ski season, beach season, etc. And if you just divided the pages up randomly, put some in control and some in variant, you might accidentally put all of your summer beach holiday locations in the variant. And then when you run a test and you make a change, you're going to see that group of pages increase in traffic, and you're going to think it's because of the change that you made, when in actual fact, it's nothing to do with that. It's just that you've got all the beach destinations in the variant page. So to avoid that, you have to do some more intelligent bucketing. That means that you end up with a nice even split of different types of pages in the control and the variant. And so to use a simple example, if you had, let's say, 100 beach destinations, it doesn't have to be perfect, but in an ideal world, 50 of those would be control pages and 50 of them would be variant pages. And so now when that same seasonal spike happens, both the control bucket and the variant bucket are going to increase in traffic. And so that is just going to look like seasonality because both buckets have increased in traffic. The other thing just to mention that, again, I'll touch on a little bit more, is please take note that these pages are different pages. So notice that in the control bucket, we have Seattle, LA, and New York, whereas in the variant bucket, it is Dallas, Austin, and Boston. We're not making two versions of the same page, and I'll explain that in a second. Okay, so we then decide what pages are going to be the variants. And again, I'm using a simplified example here. So the platform has said it's going to be Austin, Boston, and Dallas, which are the variant pages, and New York, LA, and Seattle are going to remain unchanged. We're not going to touch those pages at all, and those are going to act as the control pages. And so we would, if you were using a platform like SearchPilot, you can go into the platform and actually make that change across only the variant pages. So notice here that the content, if I just flick back and forth between the two, once we make that change, Austin, Boston, and Dallas have the content at the top of the page, whereas Seattle, LA, and New York have the content at the bottom of the page. And so now what you would do is you would add up all the traffic to the variant pages and compare it to the traffic to the control pages. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second in more detail when we look at the maths. But in a simplified way, what we're essentially saying is, after we make this change, do the variant pages outperform the forecast of the variant pages, and do the control pages perform as they would have expected? And if they do, that would imply that this is a positive change. So hopefully that makes sense. Some FAQs that constantly come up when I talk about this topic. The first one is, isn't this just the same as Optimizely, right? Isn't this just user testing, or some version of how is this different from Optimizely? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is the optimization goal. So user testing tools are designed to test users, not search engines. And so it's a bit of a silly example, but the one that I talk about is, although there's a lot of common language between user testing and SEO testing, so you will hear terms like bucketing and A/B testing and split testing, statistical significance. All of these terms are common between user testing and SEO testing, but they are just completely different goals. It's a bit like saying, isn't a baseball bat the same as a cricket bat? They're both bats, but they just do different things. And so it's not worth comparing them. If you try to use a user testing tool to do this type of analysis, you will not manage it very quickly, because you go into the platform, you make the change, and then you suddenly realize you can't measure organic traffic on these platforms. So they're just a different goal. The second difference is, most of the time, not all of the time, user testing tools are client side. And so from a user testing perspective, although there are some benefits to being server-side when you do user testing, it's generally not a problem to do user testing from a client-side perspective. Other than the flicker that you get, most people think it's still a valid methodology. It doesn't invalidate the test to run an experiment from a client-side perspective because the user still sees the change. That's not true when it comes to SEO testing, because if you make a change to your site using client-side, what's going to happen is the old version of the page is going to arrive in the browser, and then the JavaScript is going to change that to being the new version, and that can cause problems for multiple reasons. The main one being you don't know which version Googlebot sees and which version they're going to use, and the other is because of that, you then essentially invalidate the test because you don't know whether your hypothesis is wrong because Googlebot didn't see the change that you made, or it was a negative test. So when it comes to SEO testing, server-side is the superior option. And then lastly, the bucketing is completely different. So with user testing, we bucket users. With SEO testing, there is only one user that we care about, which is Googlebot. And I'll show you an image which demonstrates that in a second. So this is what that looks like visually. On the left-hand side, we have a user testing setup. And as I said earlier, there is 2 different versions of every page. So if you're running a user test on these pages and 50 people came to the New York page, 25 would see the old version with the content at the bottom of the page, and the other 25 would see the content at the top of the page. Different experiences on the same page. That doesn't work for SEO because we can't send 25 Googlebots to an A and 25 Googlebots to a B, and we certainly don't want to be showing different versions to Google because that's either going to get you in trouble with cloaking or it's going to cause duplicate content issues. And so that doesn't work from an SEO perspective. Instead of splitting users, that's why we split pages. So notice on the right-hand model, we have just different pages. There is only one version of the New York page. It has been decided before the test that New York is going to be an A page, whereas LA is going to be a B page, etc., etc. And so if 100 people were to come to the New York page, everyone is going to see the same version of the page. And crucially, so is Googlebot. There's not going to be any difference between what Googlebot sees and what users see. Just to let everyone know, I've seen a few questions come in already. I'm confident that we're going to answer all of these in the coming slides. So we're going to talk about how we measure performance. We're going to talk about how long tests should run, etc., etc. So I'm not ignoring you. I just know that I'm going to get to those. So please bear with me. So then when you look at that from a sort of a side-by-side comparison, the main thing to look at here is when you do changes to a website using client-side tools, this top row, as you can see, it really highlights that you might not be, the changes might not be visible to Google. We know that Google still struggles with JavaScript. We frequently see experiments where we change things from being client-side to server-side and we see a benefit. So we know that Googlebot doesn't always understand, and that's going to invalidate the test before it even begins. And then the rest is essentially just a feature comparison. So with Search Pilot, not only do we do SEO testing, we can do user testing, and we also do full funnel testing, which is where we can measure the impact of both. So right now, as I said, SEO testing is still quite new, and so a lot of organizations aren't doing it. Most organizations have some kind of user testing program, but even when they get winners, they're not looking at the impact of those changes on SEO. And so once they then get up and running with an SEO program, the next obvious evolution of that is to compare the two, because a lot of the tests that you run are going to impact not just Google or not just users, it's going to impact both users and search engines. And so to be able to really declare whether or not a test is positive or negative, you need to be able to say what impact there is on both users and search engines. Otherwise, you could just be cancelling out your wins. Maybe your SEO test gets a 15% increase, But unless you're also able to measure that there was at least no negative impact on users, you could wipe out more than that by any drop in user experience and conversion rate. So yeah, with Search Pilot, you can actually test both at the same time. Touched on this briefly already, but just to show you the difference between server side and client side. So with server side, this is how Search Pilot is set up. We sit between the server and the CDN. And so essentially the old version of the page comes to Search Pilot, we make whatever the change or the treatment is, and we pass that on to your CDN. And so by the time it arrives in the browser, that change has already been made. The user and search engines are oblivious to the fact that that page ever looked any different. Whereas if you look at client side, that's not true. What happens is the original version of the page arrives in the browser, then the JavaScript would fire in the browser and make that change. And so that's why sometimes you get that flicker where you'll see the old version, the flicker happens, and then you see the new version. And while that's not a great user experience, it tends not to impact user testing too much, but it does impact SEO testing. So that's why we have to do SEO testing from a server side perspective. If you do SEO testing right, it should free up a bunch of engineering resources for your team as well. Because in reality, as I said earlier, not many tests are actually positive. A good testing program would be lucky if you're hitting a 20% win rate, which means 80% of the things that you are generating right now are a waste of time. And so ideally, what you want to be doing is running these tests. Anything which is positive, you then make that into a ticket and it goes to your engineering team, whereas everything else sort of flows back into the ideation process and you learn from that and iterate and go on to the next thing. But if you do it right, it should actually save you a bunch of time and money. Okay, so how do you come up with a good test hypothesis? How do you generate ideas for SEO tests? So the first thing I would do is recommend that you read this blog post from my colleague, Emily Potter. She has written up a whole process on this, and it's far more than I'll ever be able to cover in this webinar. But I'm going to touch on the key points. But if you're interested in learning more, go read that blog post. The key thing to understand whenever you're trying to come up with test ideas is that you're essentially any test that you run is some combination of three key levers. You're either trying to make a change which will improve your existing rankings. You are either trying to make a change to get a page or a series of pages to rank for more keywords. So maybe you have a section of your site that currently ranks for 1,000 keywords and you're trying to get those to rank for 10,000 keywords. And then last is improving click-through rates. So you can have very successful tests even when your rankings don't increase, because if twice as many people click on your result, then of course that's going to result in more organic traffic. When you're trying to come up with a test hypothesis, I really like this framework from conversion.com. And just a side note, that when it comes to SEO testing, I think there's a ton that we can learn from user testing agencies, user testing tools, user testing communities, because as I said, a lot of the best practices, a lot of the methodologies are actually transferable, particularly now that a lot of things that impact users can impact SEO. And so they use this hypothesis framework that sets out a good way to sort of word your hypothesis, which says, we know that, we believe that, and we'll know by testing. And so to make that sort of a concrete example, if we look at this example from earlier, where we're going to move the content from the bottom of the page to the top, that might look something like this, where we say, we know that Google gives different levels of importance to content depending on its position on the page. We believe that moving the content higher in the page will increase the importance of that text and therefore the relevancy of that page for our target keywords. And we'll know by splitting the pages into two groups, control group that is unchanged and a variant group that has the content higher on the page, and measuring the organic traffic to each. And so that is sort of a good practice to get into before any test begins, so that you know what lever you're trying to pull and also what impact you would expect. When it comes to generating ideas, I like to use this framework that I've used for years. I used to use it in my consulting days, but I still use it when it comes to coming up with test ideas, which is to think of 3 core areas: crawling, indexing, and ranking. And then I subdivide that again into can you rank and should you rank. So when I think about the crawling and indexing, what I'm essentially looking at is there any reason why Google can't access this information? Is there any reason why they can't see the content that I'm hoping is going to be good for them? And then on ranking, it is, even if they can find that information, is it good enough that we deserve to rank? So that is a sort of a framework that I use. Another way is to visually compare your template versus your competitors. And I've done this a bunch of times. And the reason why I like to use it visually is I just find there's something different about having both sites or multiple sites in front of you, rather than looking at your competitor's site, looking at your site, looking at another competitor's site. I find you won't pick up on as many differences unless you have them visually. And so you can use whatever tool you like for this, whether it's Figma, Miro, any of those tools where you have sort of a big canvas are absolutely perfect for this. You can have both mobile and desktop side by side, and then you can just lay out your most common templates on the one page and compare them to you, between you and your competitors. And once you do that, you can produce something like the table on the right hand side. This is one that I did for the travel webinar a couple of weeks ago, where we compared 4 different websites, and then we compared what features they had on both mobile and desktop. And I divided the template into, I mean, this was just made up by me, but sort of key parts of the page. So for the travel website, I called the first section core features. So this is things like images, weather information, pricing information. Then there was an informational content area. So things like where should you eat, things to see, a section on trust and authority, a section on internal linking, and then lastly, meta information. And so even if you just do this, you can generate lots and lots of test ideas very, very quickly. Another thing to be aware of is if you are going to compare your website to your competitors, be sure that you're looking at the same page as Googlebot is seeing, because some of the content that you're looking at may be client-side rendered, and maybe Google is not even seeing it. So a really handy way to find that out, obviously, if you own a website, you can go into Search Console, you can ask Googlebot to fetch that page, and then you can see what Googlebot is seeing. But you can't do that for your competitors because you don't have Search Console for your competitors. And even if you do things like changing your user agent, you still might not be seeing the same result as Google. And so the only way I know of to be certain is to use the structured data tool to fetch your competitor's page. If you do that, you can see the HTML that Googlebot gets back, and then you can search that HTML to find out if the part of the page that you are comparing is even visible to Googlebot. And often when I do this, it's very, very common to see that something like this block of content isn't even been served to Googlebot. And so there's no point comparing that part of the page to your website and thinking that that might be why they're outranking you when Googlebot's not even seeing it anyway. And so if you are going to compare side by side, it's just super important to make sure that you're doing a fair comparison of the 2 sites. Okay, so imagine now you have a bunch of ideas, you've looked at your competitors, you've used that framework that I showed you. You still have to then decide which ones do you start with, because you've not got infinite time, you've not got infinite resources. You need a way to prioritize the ideas that you want to test. So to do that, we use this 2x2. Again, this comes from a blog post on the Search Pilot website. And there's quite a lot in this, so I'm going to go through it sort of step by step. The first thing to look at is on the x-axis, we're looking at how strong is this idea that you have come up with. So on the left-hand side, we have the case where it's a weak hypothesis. On the right-hand side, we have a really strong hypothesis. Now, that's actually, it's hard, that alone is hard to know without doing some prior testing. So to give you an example, I would consider anything which you have a case study of, or anything where there's no reason why it should be negative. So I'm thinking things which are best practice. So maybe it's things like structured data, things you've seen for a case study. I would consider all of those relatively strong hypotheses, because compared to something on the flip side, which might just be, I want to add an emoji to the title tag because I think, you know, that'll result in more clicks. It might do, but it's not really based on anything other than a hunch. And so that's the first thing we're looking at. How strong is this idea that you've come up with? Then if we look at the y-axis, we're now looking at how expensive or how resource intensive is this change that you want to make. So on the bottom, we have changes which are very expensive, and in the top, we have things which are very, very cheap to do. So an example of a cheap change would be things like title tags, meta descriptions, anything that doesn't take a lot of work or engineering resources, whereas an expensive change would be something like where you have to write a lot of content, or you're going to make a bunch of changes to your internal linking or your URL structure, your main navigation. All of those things would be expensive changes. And so you want to sort of plot your ideas into each of these quadrants and decide where they sit within this 2x2. So in an ideal world, we want all of our test ideas to be in the top right. We want ideas which are cheap to do and really strong ideas. And then once we've done that, the text, which is on the actual individual, quadrants, is about what type of result you're looking for to get. Let me rephrase that. The text on an individual quadrant is about what type of result you would require to call that experiment finished. So if you read the top right, it says, consider deploying as long as it's not trending negative. Now, the idea around this is, although we are trying to make SEO more scientific, we all have a business to run, right? We don't want SEO testing to become a reason never to make changes. And so the threshold for rolling out a test will be different depending on which quadrant the test is in. So to make that a concrete example, imagine you are a travel website and you've seen a travel case study from SearchPilot saying that we have seen adding FAQ markup to flight pages increased organic traffic. That is relevant to you, it's a case study, and it's pretty cheap to do. And so you might decide that as long as that test is not trending negative, I'm going to call that a successful test, and we're going to roll it out. Or you might decide that it needs to be 70% significant, 80% significant. And so the idea here that we talk about at SearchPilot is we're trying to do business, not science. It's important to make the best decisions we can with the information that we have, but it's equally important to remember we're not trying to, this isn't medical research that we're doing here. We're trying to roll out the best decisions we can based on the information we have. If you compare that to, say, the bottom right quadrant, where this is a good idea, but it's expensive to do, you might decide that you do want to wait for 95% significance for that, because it's going to require a lot of resources. You need the confidence to get the buy-in from the senior management team to make this change. And so I guess in summary, what you're really trying to do here is not treat every single test as the same. They will be different depending on the confidence level and the level of resource that is needed to make this change. Okay, so how do you actually make the change? So once you've got all these test ideas, how do you do it? I want to just run you through a very quick video. It's only about a minute, showing what the SearchPilot interface looks like, because it makes making changes very, very fast. And A lot of companies don't have this type of facility internally. And so another one of the questions I get a lot is, if we were to go hire a data team to do some clever maths, could we not just do this on our own? And the reason you can't is exactly this. When you do the bucketing, you're going to get a random 10,000 pages, for instance, and most customers don't have a CMS that allows you to make a change based on regex. And so with Search Pilot, we can upload a manual list of pages, or we can say, use a regex path to match certain pages, and then we can make that change to whatever page we want very, very quickly. So this is an example of making a change on eBay, a very simple title tag change, but eBay aren't a customer, I should mention. It's just an example that we like to use, and this was from a recent conference. So when you log in, you're going to set up a section for the pages you want to change. So in this instance, we're looking at product pages. And if we look at eBay's product page titles, at the moment, it's just the name of the product followed by the brand. So imagine you wanted to change that title. You could come into Search Pilot, make the change, enable that feature. And then if we just refresh that page, we're going to see that title tag change to say Dear Brighton SEO, which is when we did this video, and it also pulls in the price of that product. And so this is actually happening dynamically, where we are pulling that in, and so it'll be updated automatically. More importantly, you'll see that it's actually in the HTML of the page, so we know that Googlebot is going to see this. None of this has been done client-side, it's in the HTML. And if we wanted to run that as a test, we can now just move that across to the split test inside of the tool, and anything done here would only be applied to half of the pages within that section. Once a test has been set up and is running, you can come into your test dashboard, and this is where you're going to see the results come in day by day. We can look at the prior period where we're seeing the model, and then we use that to forecast, and then we can compare that to the actual traffic once the test began. In this instance, it looks positive. The graph below shows the confidence interval. So this is going to tell you whether it's statistically significant or whether it's just lucky. And then lastly, we also look at what percentage of the pages within the test Googlebot has actually crawled. And so this is useful to get an idea of how long should we run this test so that Google has crawled 70%, 80% or more of the pages within the section. And so, yeah, that can be a really handy tool to use as well. Hopefully that makes sense and it shows the interface and how it works. As I said, happy to answer any questions that you have. Okay, into the last section, which is how we actually detect statistical significance. So this is a deep dive on the maths. I want to stress that I'm not a data scientist. We have a really smart team that does all of this for Search Pilot, and yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions in an email after the webinar if you have any. This is a deliberately simplified example so that most people can understand the general way that measurement is done. It's not designed to be a all-encompassing explanation. So the first thing that we have to do is look at the historical traffic. So imagine you're a travel website, you want to run a test on 1,000 flight pages. We're going to make roughly 500 control pages and 500 variant pages. The first thing we have to do is look at the historical traffic levels for each bucket. So in this instance, we're looking at the historical traffic for the control pages. And we use that traffic to, that's what the solid red line is. We use the solid red line to make a model of the control traffic. And so once we have that model, we're going to use that to make a forecast in a second. We do the same thing for the variant pages. We look at the historical traffic, we build a model of those pages, and we then use both of those models to make a forecast. And so what this is essentially saying is, if we make no change to these pages, what do we think the traffic is going to be tomorrow, the day after, and so on? And so that's going to give us some kind of forecast that looks like this. And at this point, what we know is we have a model and a forecast for control pages. We have a model and a forecast for variant pages. But we also have, and this is really important to understand, we also have an understanding of the relationship between the traffic patterns of control pages compared to variant pages. So for example, in this case, even though these two buckets of pages are similar to each other, the traffic to the control bucket has always historically been a little bit higher than the traffic to the variant pages. And that's absolutely fine because they're not exactly the same pages. There are different pages within each bucket. It's impossible to make them perfect. But we do want to be as close as we can get. And the model is, again, I'm simplifying this, the model is going to make an assumption that that relationship is going to continue, right? The variant pages are always going to be slightly lower than the control pages. And I'll show why that's important in a second. Another key point to mention is that we only use organic traffic as our primary metric to detect winning and losing changes. We don't use click-through rate or rankings for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but it's good to understand why, which is those are both just proxies for organic traffic anyway. So sometimes you'll make a change and your rankings won't change, but your click-through rate will. Other times your click-through rate won't change, but your rankings will. And irrespective of whether one or both of those things change, it will show up in your organic traffic. And we can measure to a much higher sensitivity any changes in that organic traffic. So that's why our North Star, if you like, is organic traffic. That doesn't mean you can't go look at other tools for things like rank tracking data or search console data for your click-through rates, but it's not the primary metric you're looking at for SEO testing. So imagine we roll out a test, and then on day one, what we're essentially doing is we have a forecast of what we think that traffic should be to the control pages. So in this instance, we're saying we think the model is predicting that traffic to control pages should be about 2,000 sessions on day one. And then day one comes around and we compare that to the actual traffic. So again, simplified, made up example, but lo and behold, the actual traffic exactly what we predicted with 2,000 sessions. We then do the same for the variant pages. And because of that relationship that I mentioned earlier, variant pages are always been a little bit lower than control pages. So we're going to predict that the traffic for the variant pages is going to be just above 1,000 sessions per day. Again, actual traffic comes in and it's right on target. So that's day one. And this is pretty common because remember, Googlebot may not have even crawled your website at this point. One of the other things that is different about user testing compared to SEO testing is with user testing, you can turn on an experiment and you know immediately the people that you are trying to make that change for see that change instantly. Whereas in theory, you can make this change and Googlebot might not come back to your website for a week. And so it's typical that on day one, day two, day three, you might see nothing because Google might not even be aware that you have changed your website. But imagine day two comes around, again, you've done the forecast. Day two, you're forecasting 4,000 sessions. This website, it looks like maybe they have a particular seasonal or cyclical traffic pattern. Maybe day one was a Friday, day two is a Saturday, that kind of thing. In this instance, we're predicting that control will be about 4,000, but actual traffic has come in lower than the forecast. Now, remember that this is the control pages, so we haven't made any change to these pages. And this is why it gets interesting, because we know then that the reason that the traffic to the control pages is lower is nothing to do with the test that we're running, because we haven't changed these pages. But what we can use this for is to recalibrate the forecast for the variant pages. Because as I said, when we do the bucketing, we make two buckets that are statistically similar to each other. And so what we're saying is, if bucket A has gone down in traffic, this other bucket, which is statistically similar to this one, probably is also going to go down because they're similar to each other. And so rather than just blindly carry on with, I'll come back to that in a second, rather than just blindly carry on with the original forecast for variant pages, we're going to use that information that we get from the control bucket to re-forecast and say, well, actually, we think the variant pages are going to come in a little bit lower, and then we compare that to the actual traffic. Now, in this instance, actual traffic has been higher than the forecast, and although this is just one data point, if this was to happen every single day, this would imply that this is a positive change because the variant pages are performing above their forecast and the control pages are performing at least at their forecast or even below. Now, the last slide that I just pulled up there was just to show all the things that we can take into account by doing bucketing in this way. So things like Google updates, competitor performance, TV campaigns, backlink campaigns, as long as there's no reason why any of these external factors would only be happening to the control bucket, there's no reason why this would invalidate the experiment. And so again, imagine this happens on day 3. The control bucket this time has come in as expected. You can see the red circle and the red X are shown up in the same place. Whereas yet again, the variant bucket actual traffic is outperforming the forecast. And so imagine this kept happening every single day. What you would end up with is something that looks like this, where we can see the test began at this dotted line, and then there was a period where nothing happened. This is probably when Googlebot hadn't crawled the site. And then once Google notices it, the actual traffic to the variant bucket is outperforming the forecast. And so this looks like it's positive. As you saw in the video, we then look at a confidence interval chart to find out whether this is stat sig or whether it's just lucky. And in this instance, the test becomes statistically significant when the bottom of the shaded area crosses the x-axis, or if it was negative, the top of the shaded area crosses the x-axis, because we're saying the best case scenario here is that it is no better than the version that you had, whereas the likely outcome is the green line, and the worst outcome is the bottom of this confidence bound. Now, another thing to mention is if you do any SEO testing research, you probably find most people are using Google's paper called Inferring Causal Impact using Bayesian Structural Time Series. SearchPilot used to use this. Years ago, we moved a few years ago to our own neural network model, which actually doubled the sensitivity of causal impact. And what that looks like in reality is the old version on the left here. So this is the same test being run through 2 different packages. One is the old version being run on causal impact. The new version has been run on our neural network model. And you might not notice much of a difference here, but it makes a massive difference to the outcome. So this is a test using causal impact. If you were to look at that data, the conclusion of that would be that it's inconclusive. It's not statistically significant, although you might say that it's starting to trend down a little bit. If we run it through SearchPilot, it is negative almost immediately. We can see that that is a 3% decline in organic traffic. And so the difference between the 2 packages makes a big difference to the outcome of the experiment. And so that's something that is unique to SearchPilot. So that's it. Hopefully that makes sense. We're at time, but I will answer the questions that have come into the chat. There's a ton to cover in just an hour, so thank you everyone for bearing with me. I'll just quickly run through anything that I've not answered. Someone asked, A/B testing is not new. Why do you think they aren't including SEO? So I think the reason people aren't including SEO is it's still, this hasn't really been possible. People haven't done SEO testing. We've always relied on this sort of before and after. And so, yeah, it's just very difficult to do. You need a lot of resources. You need a lot of people doing test analysis. Some companies have done this. So some of the earliest companies that we know of who did this type of thing were people like Etsy, Pinterest, TripAdvisor. They have been doing it for probably 10+ years, but most companies are not doing SEO testing even today. Someone asked, you mentioned avoiding deploying losers. What about inconclusive tests? That's usually what we run into. So I think you probably answered this after you asked it, but that's where we would use the 2x2 quadrant tool. So if you're getting a lot of inconclusive results, you can either test that on a larger site section, but assuming that's not possible, you can change the threshold that you're willing to use for stat sake. So you might decide that because this is a really cheap change that is a strong hypothesis, you're happy to roll that out at 85% significance. Whereas if it's a more involved test, you might want to wait for 95%. Someone asked, how do you measure how it performs? I think I've covered that now. We look at organic traffic as our North Star. Someone asked, when running ads for a campaign, how long do you recommend the landing page be? I think that's more of a user testing question. I'm not sure I can comment on that, to be honest. I'm not sure I've understood it, to be honest. Feel free to drop me an email if I've misunderstood it. Someone else asked if we can send the recording. Yes, the recording will be sent in a week or so. Once we've made the slides and packaged it all up, you will get that automatically. Someone asked, when creating all these pages, how do you put them live in your site to start testing them? You have the control pages and the variant pages live both at the same time. Yes. So as I showed in the video, you would essentially, you do the bucketing. I mean, you would need a tool like Search Pilot, or you'd have to ask your engineering team to do this, but you would roll out the change only to the variant pages. So if you were to browse through your website manually, going from page 1 to page 2 to page 3, you would expect to see different experiences if it's a visual change, or you might not see a visual change. If you were testing something like structured data, you might be going from a page that has FAQ markup to a page that doesn't have FAQ markup to a page that does have FAQ markup, etc., etc. And Googlebot would see that as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Do you ever test blog content and how, or mainly focus on e-commerce pages? We tend to focus on revenue generating pages, but we do have some of our customers are publishers. The way that we test that is still on a template base. So we would be testing things like how much ad content you have on the page, the position of the content, how much content you have, internal linking, breadcrumbs, authorship markup, how many related blog posts that you link to. There's still tons of stuff that you can test on blog content, but you just might not, because blog content tends to be top of funnel and harder to draw conclusions and revenue from, it tends not to be as much of a focus, but you absolutely can do it. Okay, I'm going to wrap up at that. I got through all of those questions. If there's anything that I didn't cover on the webinar, I'd be happy to answer this on email. Also, if you work at a company that is interested in doing SEO testing, I also run in-house sessions for free, and I'd be happy to come and chat to you and your team about how you could set up a testing program. So yeah, thanks again everyone for showing up, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks.